And while our judges are being seated, I have to make an announcement. It is important for those of you who have cameras not to use flash in this auditorium at all. As you note, we have various media representatives here with video cameras. What we will find out is that your flash interferes with their filming. So it is our request that if you're going to take pictures, you take pictures without flash from your seated position. If you wish to take angles, then you see the 2 or 3 rows all the way in the back of the auditorium. That's where you need to take your pictures from. So obviously, get your zoom lens in operation. So I'll repeat, no flash in the auditorium. We'd appreciate your adherence to that rule. Are our interpreters in place so that we can begin?
Yes.
Okay, so now Joan Gibbs is going to be introducing the women's rights sector.
Good afternoon, and may it please the court. My name again is Joan Gibbs, and I'm going to be presenting the evidence in support of the charges concerning women. These charges include the right to life, the right to return, the right to dignity, recognition as persons, to be free from degrading treatment, the right to work, health care, housing, to education, to be free from poverty, the right to security of the person, the right to family life, privacy, and contact with missing relatives. In the interest of judicial economy, I want to call your attention first to the briefing book, which lays out in summary the case concerning women and sets forth some of the evidence in support of it. But I do want to give to the court 2 documents. One briefing paper by the Institute for Women's Policy Research on the Women of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, Multiple Disadvantages and Key Assets for Recovery, Part 1, Poverty, Race, Gender, and Class. And then an affidavit for a sister who wanted to be with us today but couldn't, Avis A. Jones DeWeaver. She's the outgoing Director of Poverty, Education, and Social Justice Programs for the Institute of Women's Policy Research and the incoming Director of Research, Public Policy, and Information Center housed at the national headquarters of the National Council of Negro Women. This is a historic organization. So she was changing jobs and was unable to be personally with her. So I want to give you first these 2 exhibits. Our first witness this afternoon is Mayaba Leventhal. Ms. Leventhal, would you take the stand?
Good afternoon.
Do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Could you state your name and briefly describe your background for the record?
My name is Mayaba Leventhal. I am a New Orleans resident of about 5 years. I work with Insight, Women of Color Against Violence.
The mic doesn't seem to be on.
The mic.
Is it not on?
No, this one here is not functioning.
Okay. You speak louder. Speak louder.
Okay.
And we need you to spell your name. We don't have the.
My bad. Okay, it's Mayaba. Last name Liebenthal.
Thank you.
Could you briefly describe yourself again, because people didn't hear you, and speak louder, please?
Like I said, I'm a resident of New Orleans for about 5 years. I work with Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, which is an anti-violence movement that talks about violence as it relates to women of color, black women, Asian women, Latino women that live at the intersection of racism and sexism, and talking about violence towards women within that framework.
Okay. First, let me ask you a preliminary question. There were supposed to be 2 people testifying from Insight today. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the second person is not here. Could you tell us the reason for her absence briefly?
Well, I think that one of the reasons why she's not here, she had to go out of town for a minute, in part due to the difficulties that she has been having being a single mother here in the city, trying to raise a 13-year-old black male in this society, in this city right now, has been fairly difficult. So she had to. I don't want to get too specific, but she had to go out of town for a minute.
Okay, thank you.
Does this person have a name? Do we need to know the name?
Well, did I leave it to you? Yes.
It's Shayna Griffin.
Okay.
Were you living in New Orleans on August 29, 2005?
Yes.
Okay. And where were you living?
I was living in the Mid-City area over on nearby Tulane and Banks, or Broad and Banks.
Do you still live at that same address?
No.
Okay. Is that your old address? Could you move back to that address if you wanted to?
No.
Why not?
The house is destroyed. It's still, we didn't really get insurance money to rebuild it, so we're still trying to rebuild, but it's kind of a wreck.
Okay. Would you say, how many years have you done work around women's rights?
A long time. More specifically, I guess, I would say maybe even up to 10 years. I'm kind of young, but
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I just want to, so that if people would, the audience in the court would get a sense of your expertise. Moving from that, though, how, in your opinion, did Katrina impact on the lives of working class and poor women in the city of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast region generally?
Well, it's been noted, especially in times of disaster and in devastated areas, that poor women, women heads of household, are unlikely to evacuate. So those images that you saw is that you see that women were most negatively impacted by this because they're traditionally the ones that do not leave. So in the evacuation process, that was a failure on all levels of government and directed at different women. So when you see that citywide there was a failure with women of color, black women being 70% of the city's demographic at the time, how that impacted women of color. And then also with what happened in Orleans Parish Prison when the sheriff's office did not evacuate, there were 650 women prisoners that were not evacuated, that were on a first floor level prison. And then they were transferred to Angola Penitentiary, which is traditionally a facility for men. So in that way, women were impacted. And then you can also see that for public housing, the failure to develop or implement an evacuation plan, 70% heads of household were women of color, black women in particular, that that was a way that women were affected by the storm. One of the other things that we saw was that with the militarization of the city, with a lot of the law enforcement coming in, is that it criminalized all people trying to survive, right? And so if you have women who were pregnant or they had children and they're trying to go out and get either care for themselves, vitamins, and it was considered looting, then you were criminalized, you were considered criminal, and your life was threatened for trying to take care of yourself and your unborn child.
Let me just ask you something to clarify something. You said that women are unlikely to evacuate. Why do you believe that? Why are women unlikely to evacuate in case of hurricanes or other
natural disasters? Traditionally, because of the role that women play in the community, being the center, kind of holding things together. You have to take care of your kids, you have to take care of your mother, you have to take care of your family. It's just statistically known that women don't really leave, especially poor women, because you don't have the access or the means or the resources to go. Okay. And it's not necessarily provided for you.
Okay. Do you feel that the state, federal, local government, what role, if any, did you feel that they played in this scenario that you described, pertaining to women in prison, for example?
Well, they made it happen. I mean, there are people that were considered to be in state custody, right? And they did nothing to remove these people from harm's way. And generally, on the vast, broad level of the government failure here in the city, I mean, the federal government was supposed to build levees that stopped water from coming in, right? And we all know that they failed in doing so. The failed evacuation plan, the way that they separated families when they evacuated was particularly problematic because they didn't really tell people that one way or the other where they were going, where their families were. You only had 2 seats on the bus, and you had to have one person. Families were separated in the actual evacuation process.
Okay, thank you. I have a few brief more questions. The next question is, how did you feel Katrina and Rita and the housing crisis created it affect the social and economic situation of women?
Well, we've seen in the city a 67% drop for female heads of household. We've seen an 83% drop.
If you're looking at a document,
Sorry, I'm looking at a document. Because we were supposed to have 2 people here, I'm just kind of looking at the stats because I'm not right off the top. So 83% drop in, let's see, families headed by poor single mothers, right? And so what we're seeing is that this is an assault on poor women by refusing to open public housing, by refusing to enforce any sort of fair housing laws, trying to put a cap on what is happening in terms of like the skyrocketing rents. The city government hasn't done anything to deal with that. And so you're seeing affordable housing disappear. You're seeing people being pushed out of the city. The failure of the reopening of the public schools, that affects women because you can't come back with your child. A lot of women couldn't come back that first year because of that reason. And so what you're seeing is that people are being pushed out.
Okay, thank you. I have actually, I think, only one more question, and that question is, how did Katrina and Rita impact on employment and economic status of women? If you could just discuss that for us.
All right, one more thing. And is there a way that I can go back because there was something that I missed around the housing crisis?
There was something what?
Around the housing crisis that I didn't.
Okay, we can go back. Okay. You want to finish on the housing crisis?
Okay, so one of the things that particularly impacts women when there is a housing crisis in a devastated area is that domestic violence rises, right? Is that you see that because of the social isolation that happens, people separated from their communities, communities scattered, is that isolation causes for a potentially violent, potentially fatal, lethal domestic violence situation, right? Though women of color are not, and women in particular, this is not the only form of violence that women face, because we know that outside of Loma Prieta, where there was an earthquake, sexual assault rose 300% after the earthquake that they held there. And there's been a complete lack of analysis, understanding, or care about the fact that this is a startling statistic. This is a startling rate of a rise of sexual assault. We don't know what's happening here in New Orleans right now. Women are particularly vulnerable. It's unsafe to not have your family here, to be in stress, to have mental health problems, and there's really no federal provision for alleviating these problems at hand.
But you think the federal government is responsible what some would describe as questions of interpersonal violence? Do you think the government shares responsibility in that?
Well, the city and the state did fund a certain amount of domestic violence shelters in the city that have all been were all washed away by the storm, and they haven't done anything to rebuild them. So there are a few over on the other side of the river in a different parish. If you can imagine separating from Orleans to other places, but they don't necessarily, they're filled. But here in the city itself, there's nowhere for women to go.
Okay, thank you. So now into my last question about the impact of the hurricanes on the employment and economic situation of women in New Orleans.
During the storm, after the storm, 180,000 workers left the state of Louisiana, or Louisiana lost 180,000 workers, 57% of which were women. And female-dominated industries such as healthcare, education, and hospitality were very hard hit. And so what you're seeing is that women are unable to come back into that sector that they were used to because of the way that they shut down the public schools, they shut down the teachers union, they shut down the public hospital, and that has made it so that women now have more responsibilities in terms of holding the families together and holding communities together, yet none of the resources to do so.
Okay. Does any of the judges have questions before I go to my next witness? Yes.
Como preguntas? It dropped and, oops, I thought it was.
Hit it. It's
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah. If I understood you correctly, there's been an 83% drop?
83.
Is there any comparative data available with regard to the drop in
In others,
returning households of all types in impoverished sectors?
not in the report that I know, but this is the one that we've been looking at.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes. Justice Ayatar. Okay. Yes.
Talked about the increase in domestic violence and sexual assaults in other disaster areas. Is there any anecdotal evidence that you have from inside, anything that would support that there has been an increase in violence against women since the hurricanes?
Besides the stories that we hear from people that come into our space and
That's what she means by anecdotal.
Oh, I'm sorry. What do you mean by anecdotal?
Anecdotal, like stories that you've heard. I mean, you may not have statistics, but is there an increase in the stories that you're hearing about domestic violence or sexual assaults, now versus prior to it? And I have a second question, but I don't want to ask.
What there is that there's kind of a silence around what's going on, and that you do, in particular, you'll hear a story here or there, but there's been no surveys, there have been no studies, there's been no attempt to figure out what's going on. And if you have everything else telling you that this is what happens during a disaster, and this has happened in every other disaster that we can look at, wouldn't you think there'd be some provision for this happening? We even had someone from Florida. It was one of the first 2 months after the storm. I think it was the governor of Florida, came here and told the city in an open forum, very specifically, you will see an increase in domestic violence because of what they saw from Hurricane Andrew and Hurricane Ivan more recently.
I'm sorry, go on.
No, nothing.
You also talked about the separation of family.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any data or any stories about families that are still separated after the hurricane?
A lot of families are still separated. I mean, when you ask that, I mean, that's such a broad question. Yes, of course, people I know. Of course, like everyone is experiencing family separation. You have people going back and forth between Houston, Atlanta, people stuck in New York, in San Francisco all the time. I mean, there's a diaspora situation that's happening. So, I mean, separated families is constantly. It's a constant, and I don't really have any specific things because I know so many people that are going through it. To pick out one story would do injustice to not picking out another one.
And are the people that are the most affected that you're talking about, if you're focusing on women, is there a particular problem? Are more women here and their families are somewhere else?
I think what we're seeing is that more women are elsewhere because of the school situation and the housing situations and the lack of resources and the lack of health care.
Yes, Justice Wright.
A few years ago, I would say about 10 years ago, the Critical Mass Project put out a statistic saying that there was an 800% increase throughout the nation of arrest of women, black women in particular. Would you say that after Hurricane Katrina, there was an increase in the arrest and imprisonment of black women in the prisons here in the area?
There was an increase of arrests of black people in general. For black women, it's still that rate, and that was Critical Resistance that put out the thing, is that has, I mean, it's a continuing rise, and so.
Yeah, we to go to our next, there's another couple questions. I wanted to draw the attention of the panel to this paper that has charts and that are responsive to some of the questions, and then there's a second part that's linked to the evidence page that has responsive to the other questions concerning specific data. Yes, I think you had a question first.
Vous dites que l'évacuation qui était un échec de l'État.
You say that the evacuation, which was a failure by the state.
Pouvez-vous préciser, est-ce que c'était, d'après vous, une insuffisance de moyens ou un manque de moyens, ou alors une volonté de l'État de ne pas organiser l'évacuation?
Was it a lack of resources, in your view, when you mentioned the evacuation, or was it a conscious policy by the state in relation to those who needed to be evacuated?
What we do know is that during the evacuation, there was a point in time where they switched the search and rescue operation to protecting, when they started talking a lot about the looters, they shifted it. So they stopped search and rescue, and then they started protecting people's property and started arresting people on charges of looting, even though the government did not show up for days. For 5 days, people on their rooftops. For 5 days, people stranded in blazing heat, and yet you were considered a looter. So it wasn't for lack of resources. It was an actual policy that they have and that they did, and that it was a neglectful act for them to not come and properly evacuate people.
Eh bien, merci. D'abord, je regrette que Shanna Griffin ne soit pas ici.
Thank you. First, I have to just, I regret that Shana Griffin cannot be here.
Parce que elle a fait le voyage en décembre 2006 pour assister à une conférence internationale à Alger.
Because in December 2006, she was able to travel to Algeria to participate in an international conference.
Justement pour soutenir des femmes palestiniennes victimes d'un plan discriminatoire, le plan Wisconsin, qui vient de l'État de Wisconsin ici et qui est appliqué en Israël.
Precisely to defend women, Palestinian women living within the state of Israel, who were subjected to the Wisconsin plan, a plan, of course, that originated here in the state of Wisconsin.
Dans votre témoignage, vous avez parlé de l'éclatement des familles.
In your testimony, you talk about the breakup of families.
Voulez-vous confirmer qu'il s'agit d'une politique, d'une décision délibérée visant à déchirer les familles pour empêcher leur regroupement et y compris la reproduction?
Is it a conscious policy to break up the families in order to promote the permanent breakup of families and even their reproduction?
Parce que ce sont des procédés qui sont utilisés dans le cadre de la purification ethnique, comme par exemple pour les populations palestiniennes.
Because, for example, when we speak of the situation of Palestine, the breakup of families is similar, and it has an origin which is ethnic cleansing.
Vous avez parlé de 70% de femmes qui sont chefs de famille, des femmes pauvres.
You speak of 70% of households who are led by women.
Pouvez-vous me confirmer qu'elles sont aussi noires?
Are these mostly black women?
Vous savez, le gouvernement américain parle beaucoup des droits des femmes pour un certain nombre de pays arabes et musulmans.
You know that the U.S. government speaks about the rights of women when it wants to target specific governments in our region.
Déjà, moi je sais que les femmes américaines travailleuses n'ont pas beaucoup de droits.
I know already that the working women in the United States do not have many rights.
Mais puisqu'il est question d'exporter les droits des femmes des États-Unis vers un certain nombre de pays,
But because what's involved as a policy is to export the so-called rights of women that are supposed to be respected in this country and export them to a certain number of countries.
j'ai cru comprendre que le gouverneur de l'État fédéral est une femme.
I understand that the governor here in the state of Louisiana is a woman.
Ce gouverneur femme a-t-elle eu une attention particulière en tant que démocrate et en tant que femme en direction des femmes victimes de l'ouragan Katrina
Did she rise
en
to
Nouvelle-Orléans?
defend and protect women as a woman governor or as a Democrat?
Parce que pour nous, c'est important d'avoir cette clarification.
For us, it's important that this should be clarified.
No, she did not. In fact, what she helped do was sign into legislation a ban on what they call, a lot of people refer to as partial birth abortion. And so if there is any sort of Supreme Court judgment on Roe versus Wade, which is the pro-choice amendment in the U.S. Constitution, if they overturn that at any point in time in the state of Louisiana, that right for women to have a late-term abortion, third-term abortion is gone. Yet somehow this was a priority to put this on the books instead of reopening a public hospital, instead of taking care of the needs of women here in New Orleans. And when you talk about, or here in Louisiana in general, and when you talk about poor women in New Orleans and the breakdown of families, yes, we are talking about black women, we are talking about black families, and we are talking about black people. And you are seeing an eradication of that happening in the city through many different ways. You asked a lot of questions. So, and when I think about some of the more, what's going on with reproductive rights in the city and reproductive rights in this country in general, is that there's a rollback. And you can have, when you're on Medicaid or if you're on certain government assistance, you can get your child, or LA CHIP, you can get your child insured, right? Your unborn child or your child, but you don't get the health insurance yourself, right? So that's kind of a bizarre process in terms of when we're talking about holistic health, right? In the breakdown and the assault of the black family, there was even a time where when people were living in hotels, right? So there was a while where people who had been displaced, didn't have homes, were put into hotels. They moved people out of hotels. They evicted people out of hotels and offered them housing in other cities. Right? That's a pretty clear get out policy that they took. There are also certain government programs out there that administer or sort of I'm trying to say, there are different kinds of reproductive means that you can have, like you can have shots, you can have Depo-Provera, you can have a pill, and there's certain government programs that push the more unhealthy sort of sterilization parts than others. And I mean, there are programs right now that you can get where you get health care, and they won't cover, if you have an abnormal pap smear, they won't cover any sort of follow-up, but they will cover sterilization. And you know who you're talking about when you're talking about poor people here in Louisiana and in New Orleans. And you know who you're talking about when you have the highest rates of diabetes and you have the high rates of heart attacks. You're talking about
Hypertension.
Hypertension, thank you. And so they're not really doing anything to alleviate these issues. We have some of the highest rates of infant mortality here in the South. You know.
Somebody.
You mentioned two specific things: the closing of public schools and the closing of public hospitals. And we know that after Hurricane Katrina, all kinds of disease became generalized. And the fact that the majority of people who lost their jobs from public schools and public hospitals were women. Is my impression correct that this also was used as a tool to expel poor communities, particularly black women, from New Orleans because they no longer had jobs, but above all, they needed to deal with disease that was threatening their family and most particularly children. Is my impression correct that?
Yes. Well,
Vicente Cândido, do Brasil. 3 perguntas para o depoente.
My name is Vicente Cândido from Brazil. 3 questions for the witness.
Você, como militante de movimento social, acho que pode nos ajudar e esclarecer.
You as a militant in the social movements can help us understand.
Queria ouvir de você o comportamento da polícia e dos governos nos 3 níveis em tempos normais. Por exemplo, antes do furacão, em relação à discriminação da polícia racial.
I want you to address the question, the behavior of the federal of the authorities at all levels, federal, state, and local, before the hurricane.
E a posição dos comportamento dos governos na aplicação das políticas sociais. Né?
In relation to implementation of social programs, and particularly around women.
Segunda questão.
Second.
Nós ouvimos relatos aqui durante o dia.
We heard testimonies here today, throughout the day.
Da situação de pessoas legalizadas, americanos ou não legalizados.
Regarding immigrants, legal or not.
Nós sabemos que aqui tem vários trabalhadores latinos ilegais.
We know that there are many, particularly Latino immigrant workers who are without papers.
Quais as informações que você poderia nos passar? Como foi o tratamento com esses trabalhadores ou moradores não legais?
Can you address the question of the immigrant families and workers in relation to Katrina?
A última pergunta é sobre os parlamentares americanos.
The third question has
Pelo
to
menos
do
dois
with
níveis, né? Senadores, deputados.
the elected officials in Congress.
Pelos relatos aqui dos vários depoentes, parece que não existe Congresso americano, deputados ou senadores para essas questões, a não ser a ex-deputada aqui presente e alguma solidariedade muito pontual.
It would appear
Pouco envolvimento do Congresso americano.
from the testimonies that you don't have a Congress in this country, that at least that at no level of government were they concerned about these questions. Is my impression correct?
A impressão que nos passa é que há uma ignorância, um desconhecimento assim, não teve eco no Congresso americano toda essa questão do Katrina e também da discriminação racial em outros períodos.
Was it a lack of knowledge, or just simply did they just turn their backs on what was happening and on offering solutions that the people were demanding?
Well, yeah, I noted them down for you. The first question was with respect to the behavior of federal authorities before Hurricane Katrina, and what was, I guess, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but how do you feel federal authorities and others would be treated women and families before the hurricane?
Badly. I feel that that in terms of any sort of federal care, in terms of reproductive justice or reproductive care, this is a hostile environment for women to have reproductive justice or any sort of control over their own bodies or means to be able to control what happens to their bodies. I feel that in terms of the way that that especially here people are treated in terms of terminating pregnancies, there are very few places to do that, and I think that also in terms of grassroots and other government-funded places, you get 2 different kinds of justice. You get 2 different kinds of care if you're white or not white. There are places that will push different policies on women of color, on black women, Asian women, Latino women, because if you have, for instance, an organization like Planned Parenthood, I mean, that was started by a eugenicist. You know, they really do push policies and they push things that are bad for you and may limit your access to care or may limit your ability to have a child in the future without really informing women that that is what they're doing. So in terms of that, and the federal government is just kind of absent, really, on that question.
Maybe perhaps you should explain, since this is an international body, what Planned Parenthood is and what who you are referring to when you characterize it as being founded by eugenicists.
Well, when you say, so Planned Parenthood, because there is such bad health care here, or no health care, there are certain institutions that have been set up to sort of catch the fallout. And Planned Parenthood is a nonprofit organization set up. They sound very good on paper that they give low cost, pap smears, they give low cost contraceptives, but they don't really, but when I say that they were founded by a eugenicist, they were talking about someone who was into the idea of ethnic cleansing. And it was sort of founded on this idea that when you say population control, family planning, you're really meaning like population control. The federal government does have other things on the books, like the Hyde Amendment, which, let's see how that one works. The Hyde Amendment, it's federal money that will, I can't talk about that right now. Sorry, I'm driving.
I'll talk about it in the end. Go ahead. Okay. The second question was with respect to how immigrants and families were affected by the hurricanes.
Well, I think that what the government did was that they allowed for more migrant labor to come into the city by suspending certain acts that allowed them to be able to be paid fairly for their wages. And then also, one of the interesting things that law enforcement played a part in is that you can see people that come in, migrant workers who are particularly vulnerable to being exploited, is that they would go clean up a place, and then the contractor or the person who was in charge would just call ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, and just raid the place. And, sort of having the government then reinforce this exploitation of labor. For families in general, I know that there are more families moving here. Women, Latina women are moving here, but there isn't necessarily any sort of like translation that happens. And I think that there is generally a fear that when people go to get medical care, that they're then either going to get reported or deported or face some sort of action for just trying to take care of themselves.
Okay. And the last question was with respect to elected officials and their response to Katrina.
There really hasn't been one. They show up now, they showed up yesterday, thanks. But they just haven't been here and they don't really pay attention, and then there's been, I think Cynthia McKinney is one of the only people. She was shocked. She was one of the first people to show up, actually, and she's like, where are your she asked the same question, and we had the same answer then as we do now, so.
Is there any further questions? Yes.
Okay. Voy.
Rafael Pinto, Brasil.
Rafael Pinto from Brazil.
A questão que eu faço é a seguinte.
My question's the following.
Nós sabemos que New Orleans é berço da cultura negra.
We know that New Orleans is really the cradle of black culture.
Aqui nos Estados Unidos, aqui na diáspora, como outras cidades semelhantes.
And the diaspora, as other cities, also play that role.
E do ponto de vista da transmissão e resistência cultural, a mulher negra tem papel fundamental.
From the point of view of the transmission of history and culture and tradition, the black woman plays a fundamental role.
Do ponto de vista do processo civilizatório, no que diz respeito à visão africana, a cosmovisão africana no mundo e na diáspora.
From the point of view of maintaining and carrying forth the civilization of our people in the diaspora.
Você pode falar alguma coisa a respeito disso, na medida em que você é uma militante feminista e como se encontra a situação da mulher nesse processo, nesse momento.
Could you address this question particularly from the transmission, from the point of view of the transmitting our legacy, our heritage, and our culture, and how that's been impacted by this situation with Katrina?
Did you understand the question? The question was with respect to women as to transmitters of culture and tradition, and how that was affected by, particularly in New Orleans, and how it was affected by the hurricanes.
That's a good question. I think that, you know, with people in general being displaced, there have been people that have tried to preserve culture in other places. I know that people in San Francisco have been trying to pull together different plays and spoken word things. The culture here is still, it's going. People are trying to maintain. I don't really know any other sort of answer to that question.
Other questions? Yes. Mr. Garcia?
Sí. Esta mañana recibimos un testimonio de una mujer.
This morning we heard a testimony from a woman,
Shirley, su
Shirley.
nombre, y expresó la forma como se violaron sus derechos,
And expressed the way through which her rights were violated.
que fue porque intentó buscar alimento con un cheque sin fondo para sus hijos y su familia.
Because she sought to get food with a check that bounced for her family.
Y también la acusaron de irresponsabilidad materna.
And they were accused her of maternal irresponsibility.
Por eso fue arrestada
And for that reason,
y le
she was
violaron
arrested.
los más esenciales derechos
And
a la
her
salud,
most fundamental rights to health were violated,
separación de su familia,
separation of her family,
etc.
etc.
Nosotros como jueces de este tribunal
We as members of as judges in this tribunal
necesitamos cada vez más
need each time more
evidencias y denuncias concretas
testimonies that are
sobre
concrete
violación, en este caso, de los derechos de la mujer.
on the violations of women's rights.
Usted habló de que más de 500 mujeres
About how more than 500
fueron
women
encarceladas.
were jailed.
Necesitamos la tipificación
We need the typology,
de por qué las encarcelaron,
why they were arrested,
cuál fue el motivo por los cuales las encarcelaron.
what were the motives.
Y por eso pongo el ejemplo de esta mañana del caso de Shirley,
And that's why I put forward the
quien
case of
expresó
Shirley.
y tipificó por qué esos casos de cancelamiento.
It would seem was an expression of one of, at least
El otro
the
es
reason for these
que usted
jails.
también habló
You spoke
sobre los tipos de violencia
the types of violence,
y se centralizó en lo que más conocemos, o sea, la violencia doméstica.
and you mentioned the question of domestic violence.
Pero necesitamos conocer qué otro tipo de violencia
We want to know what other forms of violence women
han
are
caracterizado la violencia de los derechos de la mujer.
subjected in relation to women's.
Por ejemplo,
Right.
violencia sexual de parte de la policía,
Was there
si existe.
a sexual assault on the part of the police?
Esos son casos que hay que decirlo con toda crudeza.
If those exist, they
¿De
have to
acuerdo?
be they have to be put they have to be revealed.
¿Mm? Violencia psicológica
Psychological violence
de parte del Estado,
on the part of the state,
que ya debemos declararlo como un Estado terrorista
which at least
y
in my point of view,
policial,
has to be declared terrorist
como
and
es
police
el
state,
Estado de Estados Unidos.
which is the state of the United States.
Necesitamos, por favor, la mayor cantidad de datos precisos para poder elevar
We need the
esto a
most
instancias internacionales.
amount of concrete
Cuando ya no
documentation
funciona el
evidence to take
Estado de
this
Derecho,
to take to the international level, because when the
tenemos que
state of
pasar a
law,
otra instancia.
this
Y
state
aquí
of
hay un vacío
law,
del Estado de Derecho.
is not in place, we have to move to a different level.
Entonces se
and here-
impone el estado de necesidad del pueblo.
And that state of the needs of the people is
Y por
what's
eso
imposed.
estamos aquí,
And that's why we're here.
hombres y mujeres de otra parte del mundo que
And
hemos
women
tenido este tipo de experiencia.
From other parts of the world where we too have been experienced these situations.
Gracias, Shannon.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to try and break that down and answer the different questions that you asked. The 650 women, along with the other, I guess it was 8,000 people in Orleans Parish Prison overall, were mostly in there for minor offenses. You have petty drug charges. You have, for women, you see a lot of prostitution. And I think that now it's very difficult to get out of jail if you're in for sex offense or like for being a prostitute, because it's like there's a fear of flight in that they say, you know, when you want to try and bond someone out, you know, you have to go and you have to pay to get your friend back. And what they do is that they tell you that with prostitutes there's a fear of flight. And so it's very hard to get people out if you get put in on those charges. So the nature of the crime then makes it more difficult for women to come in and out. They were in there for mostly for petty violations, small things. I know that nationwide, in terms of like women that are in for capital offense, that wouldn't have been here in New Orleans, but more in the women's facility in the center of Louisiana. 80% of the women that are in there for life are in for killing their abusers. And that law has just been overturned here. An amendment has been done in the state. However, it's not retroactive. So you have women who, say, killed their abuser back in 1998, are in there for life. They can't get out, even though that's been turned over now. For law enforcement violence and sexual assault with women, this is something also that is not very spoken. When interviews are conducted outside of the prison, sometimes you'll get a woman who will talk about an illegal strip search. You know, verbal assault